welcome to this online session of the Lahore Literature Festival. I'm Kamila Shamsie, sadly not with you in person, but happily in conversation with one of the great writers of our time. Damon Galgut is a South African novelist and playwright. His novels include The Good Doctor and In a Strange Room, both shortlisted for the Booker Prize, which he won last year for his most recent novel, The Promise. The Booker Prize judges said of it, as a spectacular demonstration of how the novel can make us see and think afresh, The Promise delivers. It's my very great pleasure to be in conversation with Damon today as he comes to us from Cape Town. Damon, welcome.
Thank you, Kamala, for that very generous introduction. I'm really pleased to be talking to you and very sorry I'm not there in person either, but perhaps another year.
Some year we'll get you to Lahore and hopefully get me there as well at the same time.
Indeed.
I want to jump in, Damon, with a question that I always want to know of novels and novelists that I love, which is, what was the point of origin? How did this start for you? Was it an image, an idea, a conversation?
It was a conversation, although that's slightly misleading because in a sense, as I'm sure you know, novels begin before the initial idea in that one is looking for a subject. In my case, it takes me quite a while. I can take years before I find what it is I want to do next. I take these things seriously because, you know, writing a book is not something one just throws off lightly. You're committing years of your life to this project. So you need to be sure it's a project that is going to keep you interested and engaged for, you know, the duration. So I think in some semi-conscious way, I was looking for a story that fitted with my current preoccupations, if you like. And it came to me in the form of a conversation with a friend who was talking to me one day about, rather depressingly, the family funerals that he's been to. He's the last person left in his family. He's attended the funerals of his parents and his brother and his sister. I mean, he's not a young person, so these are not necessarily tragic deaths or unexpected deaths, but still he was making the family anecdotes attached to these events very funny. So I had this sort of, contradictory mix of being entertained and moved at the same time. And somewhere in all of that, maybe not that day, the idea came to me that might be a way to tell the story of a family, and not the usual approach, which is also attractive, as I'm sure you would understand. One's looking for novel, unusual ways to approach narratives. So I thought, the device of using 4 family funerals, not focusing on anything in between, just opening the lens on this couple of days where a person is being put into the ground and mourned, and letting readers fill in the blanks in between, as it were, for themselves. This seemed like an attractive notion, and indeed it was attractive and engaging enough to keep me at it for however many years this particular book took. It's all a bit blurry by now.
Funerals and families are a particularly potent mix, aren't they?
Well, like marriages, funerals are those events that bring a whole family together. So they're full of all sorts of unspoken tensions, aside from the immediate emotions of a funeral. You tell people that, oh, my book's about 4 funerals, and it sounds like the most depressing prospect in the world, but in fact, you're focusing actually on living people and the antics of living people. So that's kind of fodder for comedy more than anything. Although I think of it as a tragicomic book. I think of life as a tragicomic event generally.
There's a lot of lightness and play in the novel, but I want to talk to you, before we move on to that, to one other aspect, which is you have, of course, 4 funerals, but at some point you have to make the decision about when these funerals would be. And it so happens that they are at these 4 different stages, you might say, of South Africa's political history. Can you talk about that a little, about why those 4 moments, and at what point you you knew you wanted to do that?
Yeah, it was kind of a secondary decision that my compulsion initially was to look at this family, as I say, through this particular device. And the device appealed to me because of what it does with time and what it would allow me to play with time-wise, in what was left out more than what was focused on. But when I'd sort of been preoccupied with this idea for a while, I realized that if you just, you know, broaden the picture a little bit, you could show some of the background of the country, and that the life of the country also develops just like the life of an individual does, and that if I spaced the funerals more or less a decade apart, that I could convey something of what was going on in South Africa in the 4 different decades that happened to be, you know, the 4 decades of my adult life. We've moved very obviously from the high days of apartheid through to, you know, some sort of national reconciliation into a somewhat depressing decline since then. But, you know, that trajectory could be made evident in the background. And for me, it really was a background thing. It was a kind of political wallpaper. But seems a lot of commentators and critics have seized on it as if it was the main point, which has amused me slightly, although South Africa being what it is, it's understandable that people give prominence to the history, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I do wonder, you know, for myself and for you and for a lot of writers, if there's ever really a way around or through that where you know that the political backdrop is the backdrop of people's lives and you can't really leave it out because people don't leave it out. It's part of conversation. And yet, if there are countries that are seen by outsiders, particularly through the lens of their politics, is it somewhat wearying that there will be so many people who will rush not to see your characters as characters, but, you know, always as metaphors, or to see the foreground of the characters really as the background, and the background of politics is the foreground?
Yeah, it does seem to be a bit of a South African curse, that. I mean, not only South Africa, I guess, countries like, I don't know, Israel or maybe Ireland that have such a fraught and charged recent history. The history tends to overpower all other stories, but there is a sense in which South African writers are expected to account for our recent past in a way that, you know, maybe writers in the UK are not. I happen to think we're all products of our time and place. It's just, you know, prominence is given to those factors in a place like this. But, you know, there are 2 edges to that blade, because in one sense, it's an expectation that can feel quite confining. In another sense, you know, we live in this country with history that really matters, in the sense that the stakes are very high, and how these things work themselves out has a big impact on the future of everybody here. So in a certain sense, you're being gifted with really powerful themes that have an urgency to them. So, you know, there is a sort of a trade-off for a writer anyway, who has to approach projects with a kind of an amoral eye. If I lived in a more sort of peaceful, placid place, I might have a wider range of subjects to pick from, but they are less likely to be, you know, charged with the kind of voltage that South African themes and situations often are. So, yeah, I don't know how I feel about the trade-off. I think in my earlier years, I would have preferred to think of myself as an apolitical writer. Now now I'm not so sure. It's an internal debate I have with myself.
Yeah. You know, the last time we met, Damon, was at the Jaipur Literature Festival, which was, I think, 2015. And you and I and Eleanor Catton were on a panel about writing historical fiction. And you just written Arctic Summer, which I'm sure a lot of people know, which, you know, is sort of fictionalized version of E.M. Forster, and his relationship to India and to Rasa Masood is a big part of that. And I'd just written A Garden Every Stone, and Eleanor Catton had just, in fact, won the Booker for the Luminaries. And there was a question I asked both of you, which was, we've all worked with novels set in contemporary times in the world we've grown up with, and we've also written historical fiction. And do you think next time round, which would you want to do? And it was very interesting because Eleanor was absolutely adamant that she wanted to stay with the past. And I won't forget your answer because it really did resonate so strongly with me. You said, writing a novel is hard. Why make it harder by putting these extra demands on yourself of, finding out about other times and places? And I wondered what the experience of writing this one was, the promise was compared to Arctic Summer. I mean, there's such a sense of play in it for all its seriousness that I wondered if that was part of your experience of writing and whether you stand by the idea that, no more historical fiction.
Well, I'm probably less adamant about it now. There are no easy novels. Novels don't, arrive with ease.
Yeah.
I guess it's different challenges every time. I mean, yeah, the challenges of writing historical fiction are not small, for sure. But in the case of this book, I guess the history, even though you could see it as a kind of historical novel. The 80s are gone in South Africa, that time's gone. But it happens to be a period I lived through and have very vivid impressions of. So in a sense, I really didn't have to dig very deep for the history of it. It's in my cells almost. And the easiest part of this novel was in giving voice to my own experience. That's always the case, I guess. I mean, what's hard is when you have to stretch a little bit imaginatively to fit yourself into a sensibility that's not really within range. But that didn't feel like the case here. I certainly don't want to give you the impression it was an easy book to write. It provided all the usual torments, but they're arranged in a different sort of formation. So the obstacle course is always slightly altered every time.
I mean, I suspect if the writing were too easy, you might worry a bit that you're not stretching yourself. But I mean, my particular question was is that sense of play in the narrative voice, was it fun to write? Or was there was there pleasure in that?
Yes, there was. But arriving at that narrative voice was not so straightforward. I mean, I began writing the book in quite a different voice, a far more conventional voice, I guess. I knew it would be a third-person novel, that it would have a sort of omniscient narrator, as a third-person novel must. And I guess, the mental examples that I was following were the conventional ones. But I was quite frustrated by those conventions. And it was only when I broke away from the novel to do a couple of drafts of a film script that got offered to me. And it was probably in a certain way bad timing, because I was, embedded in the book and my preoccupations were there, but I needed money and I did the film script for money. But when I came back to my novel, I brought back with me some of the sensibility of the camera, I guess. And I suddenly saw that I could make the narrative behave in the same way that a camera might. Certainly the way my mind had been working in conceiving of the film script, which is to say I found a voice that moved very rapidly from one point of view to another, that cut, as it were, from the perspective of one character to another perspective, sometimes from one scene to another, and sometimes within a paragraph or even within a sentence. So that was very exciting for me and liberating, and it kind of it gave free rein to what I guess is part of my own natural way of seeing things. So there's always a sort of an ease and a flow that comes with one's internal narrative if you're not blocking yourself or trying to channel your inner voice. So I had a lot of fun, enormous amount of fun. I let my humor loose. I allowed myself to be dry and sardonic about tragic events and so on. And of course, some of those advantages are now, in retrospect, obvious it put some distance between me and the dark raw material of the book. It allowed me to sort of comment on, one character in relation to another and so on. But it would be easy to set aside in my mind how much anxiety that caused me, because I didn't know at any point in the book whether this narrative voice was working or not. I didn't really have any predecessors to compare it to. So, I did at a couple of points take pieces of the book to friends I trusted, ask them, please just read this and tell me honestly, is this a total mess? And the friends very kindly said, no, they really liked it. But can you trust the verdict of your friends? They want to please you. So, the doubts remained until right at the end. So I'm not sure I'd choose to live with such anxiety again. I've written a couple of failed novels along the way, novels that my agent just wouldn't send out. And I rather feared I might have done that again. So it came as a huge relief to discover that wasn't the case. I mean, throwing away 4 or 5 years worth of work is not a joke.
No. It's interesting that you talk in terms of film script, because when I started reading the novel, I had just been talking to some people about Greek tragedy, and actually I thought of quite early on with that narrative voice, I sort of heard a little echo of a Greek chorus, and I wondered if your theatre background had come into play at all in working out that narrative voice as well.
Not in the planning of it, but in the execution, I was certainly aware of creating that sort of choral effect where you could, because often the basic principle I was trying to follow with the narrative voice was that it was a third person voice, so much so that most of the time it registers, or I wanted it to register as a kind of personality, not a character who's taking part in the action, but somebody who's almost present and observing and commenting. But that when the narrative voice got very, very close to a particular character, sometimes it would get sucked into the character's head, as it were, and would lapse into the first person. So you'll get a very intimate moments where the book is speaking out of a character's skull. But then there are other moments where the narrative voice seems to slide into being a commentary from a community out there, a sort of general community of other South Africans who would, let loose with their moral judgments and so on. And that in particular has a kind of a choral effect, which fitted with my instincts. Part of my frustration with my initial approach was that you really cannot give a full account of this country if you lock yourself into one voice. You're just by implication excluding multiple perspectives on a very, very complex situation. So it's pleasing to be able to convey, the fragmented effect of multiple perspectives, because that's the reality. Nobody here sees anything the same way, which may be true elsewhere, but it's acutely true of South Africa.
It's pretty true in Pakistan, I should tell you. But since we've been talking about the narrative voice, could we have a bit of a reading so we can hear that?
Sure. I mean, it's tricky to find a good self-contained reading for exactly the reason that, there's so much leaping about. So if you do just a short extract, it could be confusing for readers. But I found something that I think is sort of sufficiently on one track to convey itself. Just to set the scene a little bit, this is following the youngest daughter of the family, whose name is Amor, close to the beginning of the book, where she's been sitting on a koppie, which is a small hill behind the house, where there's a gathering of family and friends after the death of her mother. She doesn't want to be part of that, so she's sort of absented herself, but she's sneaking back down into the house. She wanders down the other side of the koppie, pausing here and there to look at a rock or a leaf, to her own house, or the house she thinks of as her own. By the time she comes in through the back door, 133 minutes and 22 seconds have passed since she ran away. 4 cars, including the long dark one, have departed. A single new one has arrived. The telephone has rung 18 times, the doorbell twice, on one occasion because somebody has sent flowers that improbably turn up all the way out here. 22 cups of tea, 6 mugs of coffee, 3 glasses of cool drink, and 6 brandy and cokes have been consumed. The 3 toilets downstairs, unused to such traffic, have between them flushed 27 times, carrying away 9.8 liters of urine, 5.2 liters of shit, 1 stomachful of regurgitated food, and 5 milliliters of sperm. Numbers go on and on, but what does mathematics help? In any human life, there's really only one of everything. As she creeps into the kitchen, she can hear distant voices, though this part of the house is quiet. She climbs the stairs to the 2nd floor, starts up the passage to her room. On the way, she has to pass the door to Ma's room, empty now. Shalome gone to wash the bedding, and even though she knows what didn't happen here, she has to go inside. Small girl looking at her mother's things. She knows all of it by heart. How many steps from the door to the bed, where the light switch is for the lamp, the swirly orange pattern in the carpet, like the onset of a headache, etc., etc. Out the corner of her eye, she thinks she sees Ma's face appear in the mirror, but when she looks directly, it's gone. Instead, she can smell her mother, or a mix of smells she thinks of as her mother, but are actually the traces of recent events involving puke, incense, blood, medicine, perfume, and an underlying dark note, perhaps the smell of the sickness itself, exhaled by the walls, hovering in the air. So I'll leave it there, but I hope it gives some flavor, at least, of the oddness of the narrative and also the fact it's a narrative that keeps adjusting itself, and doubting its own veracity, basically. So yeah, without cluttering it anymore, that's a small taste.
Thank you. It really is a wonderful book, by the way, for those of you who are listening. It's wonderful because of the many different things it does, and the fact that we have these stories that, on one hand, there are the funerals and there's all kinds of familial tension and unhappiness, but there's also this voice which is sort of light and darting and playful and buckish, but also in other moments very moving. And it is, really so beautifully and elegantly done. And I wanted to ask something, Damon, and I don't even know if this is any good as a question, but I'm going to ask it, which is, I think the best writing often furnishes the most elegant solution to particular questions or problems that the writer might have. And if you don't come up with a good solution, you may have a problem in the novel. But if you come up with a good enough solution, it elevates everything. And I wondered whether there was a question for you around representing Black lives, or whether this is a question that, I know has come to the fore more in places like America in the last sort of few years. But as a South African writer, presumably you've had to think about the different ways in which this is or isn't done for a very long time. But I wondered if there's you were thinking through, in particular, the character of Shalome, who is both central and absolutely marginal in a very deliberate way, and what your thinking was around that, and how you were going to use that narrative voice with respect to her and also to her son Lucas.
Yeah, I mean, it's a thorny area, not just in South Africa, but obviously in South Africa in particular, how white writers represent the lives of Black people. And of course, here as elsewhere, there's a very strong and angry strain of identity politics that would claim I, as a white man, have no right to speak about Black lives because I have no understanding of that experience, which empirically speaking is true. I don't. However, I do want to quite emphatically say before I respond to the rest of your question that my reservations and the solution that I found in this regard has nothing to do with capitulating to identity politics. Because what I've done, and several people have picked up on it and been bothered by it, all of them from elsewhere, not South Africans, which is interesting, is that I've depicted the inner lives of all the white characters, and I have refrained from crossing a certain threshold with the black characters. That's not because I'm afraid to go there, quite the opposite. I do see it as imperative. Look, to put it quite bluntly, the very basis of fiction lies in imagining how it feels to be somebody not you. I don't know how it feels to be you. I haven't a clue. I haven't a clue what a woman feels about the world, just on a biological level. But fiction is premised on how convincingly you make that imaginative leap. And it's on that basis I'd like to be judged, not on my ideological positions. So I decided not to go into the lives of the black characters, and in particular, not the life of the central black characters, Shalome, who is the black woman to whom this promise has been made, and the promise has not been fulfilled. Because I wanted her to register at the center of the book as an absence. And I wanted that absence to be problematic for me. So there is a sense in which if I had gone into her inner life, which of course would be as rich and varied and complicated as the lives of the white characters, if I'd done that, in a literary sense, I would have placed her on the same level as all the other characters, primarily white, around her. And there's an implicit suggestion in that her importance is equal to theirs. She occupies an equal space in the universe. And that's manifestly not true. I mean, this country is full of people like Shalome, uneducated, rural people who have spent their entire lives working for white families and sacrificed a huge deal in that endeavor. The fact is that almost 30 years into democracy, Shalome and people like her still have no voice here, no presence whatsoever, no agency, you could put it that way. And I wanted to turn that real life problem into a literary problem. It's interesting to me that several British commentators are bothered by it, but they seem bothered or exercised on a literary level, which is to say they're pointing at me and saying, well, you failed in your literary duty here. You're supposed to inhabit and imagine all your characters. Well, I have inhabited her life in my mind, and I have imagined it, but I've chosen not to speak it because she cannot speak her own position. So, that was the logic. I'm not sure, it's an interesting question, whether in 20 years from now, I'll still feel I made the right decision in that regard. But the fact that it's bothersome for people is kind of pleasing to me. As a side note, I just want to add, I know the traditional pronunciation of her name is Shalome, but in South Africa, we tend to squash all the vowel sounds underfoot. So Shalome, which happens to be the name of my first nanny, the black lady who looked after me when I was a child, and was therefore, a very important name to me. That was her name, and it's a kind of mental tribute, even if she never reads my book.
I did think there was one of the things that it does so well is gesture in single sentences to these kind of complications. So where you have your narrator, for instance, looking at Lucas when he's quite young, and there's something going on with him, and the narrative voice says, some private history there, don't know him well enough to ask. Right there you have that, the sense that the narrator, of course, is not the omniscient, but that the narrator is the narrator is white. The narrator has a certain limit to his imagination or his engagement, let's say, not imagine, but where he wants to engage his imagination. And I think that's very beautifully and cleverly done through the whole novel.
Well, I'm not sure my explanation of this is going to come across coherently, but I didn't feel in the writing of the book, I mean, as I perhaps sort of expressed earlier, that the identity of the narrator is fixed. It seems to slide a little bit, and I went with that sliding. So at certain times it could be male, other times could be female, but there are also moments when it could be an inhuman voice. I mean, there are times when you know, the narrator says things like, you know, this is the sort of behavior that you humans indulge in, which implies, you know, the narrator isn't. And that lack of fixity, to put it that way, is part of my point, which is, I guess, that you know, all stories are told by someone, but there are multiple, in fact, infinite ways, infinite positions from which stories can be narrated. So, you know, that dislocation, which is a little bit disconcerting, that moving from one perspective to another is an echo, you know, of the multiple perspectives of the narrative itself, but also is meant to be bothersome to the reader in the same way. Like, you can't really get a handle on who is telling this, where it's coming from, and so on. And, you know, if the only point of that is to raise a question in the reader's mind, who is it that's telling the story? Why is this happening? That may be reason enough. I'll leave it as that.
Yeah. I mean, you know, the way you talk about the narrating, the questioning, of course, this novel very much, you can feel the great modernists behind it in, you know, in the best sort of way. You can feel that you've been reading them. And I know that you came to Virginia Woolf at a later point in life. Can you talk about, because I did think of Woolf in the best sort of way while reading it. And can you talk about how she became someone to read and think about?
Yeah, she, in my earlier years, I mean, the years, I guess my 20s primarily, when, you know, writing became the sort of dominant force of my life and the thing that I really, above all other things, wanted to do, the writers who energized and inspired my imagination were the modernists. I'm not highly educated in a literary sense. My education has come to me through my reading. So I have no academic appreciation of writers like Virginia Woolf or William Faulkner and so on. My appreciation of them is in reading what they've done and thinking, oh, wow, this is extraordinary. And it's usually extraordinary because it's breaking the expected rules. So, you know, for me, modernism marks a kind of high point in the literary project, where the moment maybe where the novel was at its strongest and boldest. So, you know, when I embarked on this unusual voice and was feeling insecure in the way that I've, you know, confessed to you, it was helpful to be able to refer in my mind to writers who'd broken the rules before and carried it off. I guess the biggest guiding spirit where this book was concerned was William Faulkner, who very famously played with voice. I mean, of course, you know, he took his inspiration from Joyce. All books feed on other books. But to my mind, Faulkner did something with voice that was easier for me to relate to than reading Joyce. I mean, I've read dutifully Ulysses, but I didn't get as much pleasure from Ulysses as I did from As I Lay Dying, for example. But it was really only in the writing of the book that, you know, I was talking about my troubles with a writer friend who said, oh, but you have to read Virginia Woolf. I mean, she's the person who's, you know, been a trailblazer in this particular area. And that was the first time I encountered Woolf. I mean, at the very late age of 50 something, but it was an absolute revelation. Unfortunately, she came to me too late to be a direct effect on this particular book, but she gave me a sort of retrospective permission, if you like, where Faulkner is very, very good with voice, Virginia Woolf is extraordinary with time. And yeah, that was very freeing to me, because I realized in the same way that all the stories have been told, I guess all the techniques have been employed too, but there's some very, very, very fine practitioners have wielded these techniques before. So however inadequately, it was legitimate to try to imitate this breaking of the form.
I thought I might be hearing a little echo of the end of A Passage to India in the end of just that final scene. I wonder if, you know, that was something you...
That's interesting, actually. I was somewhat startled when I read a review. James Wood wrote a magnificent review, one I'd be happy to have, tacked to my gravestone one day, of the book, in which he talked about the connection maybe between the end of E.M. Forster's book, Howard's End, and its idyllic scene of life around the house, and he was comparing it to the very unidyllic scene around this country house in South Africa. But I can really say that I had no conscious connection in my mind between E.M. Forster or what he'd written and this book. And yet I recognized the link when he pointed it out, which is to say, I think there are unconscious carryovers that one makes. And the moment you said that, there is an echo in my mind. I really don't think consciously I work with the end of Passage to India, but I can see exactly why it would evoke that for you. So, the books you read are stored away in there somewhere, and little bits of them that made an impression, those little buttons are there too. So I do think one draws on bits of reading that have been especially memorable or moving for you at difficult moments in one's own narrative. So without being able to consciously lay claim to that connection, I'm quite happy to, allow it.
Well, it is the odd thing when you're doing something like this, Damon, where someone is asking what your book is we're essentially saying, so what went on in your unconscious? The whole point is it was your unconscious.
Well, that's true. That's true. And I don't know about you, but for me, writing a book is generally a process of starting with absolutely unconscious impulses. I mean, you're drawn to particular ideas or themes or characters without knowing why they draw you. They just have an inherent significance. And the process of writing the book is, in a certain sense, the process of lifting these themes from unconsciousness into, consciousness and clarity. So if you can name your unconscious impulses by the end of the book, that's those are the final refining stages of the book. So, in a certain sense, one writes the book in order to ultimately understand at the very end why you started writing it.
Can I ask you to say a bit about seasons? Because each funeral is in a different season, isn't it?
Yeah, well spotted. Not everybody's picked up on that, but yes. The real subject of this book for me is time, the passage of time. As I say, I was drawn by this idea of the funerals in different decades because of what you can show with the big changes that have taken place on the level of individual life, on the level of national life. And of course, one way to underscore that is to refer indirectly to the seasons passing, because that's how we mark the passage of time. So I deliberately built it into the book, but not in an ostentatious way. So I'm very pleased you did pick up on that. I mean, on another level, if you're doing 4 panels to your story, you have to provide a bit of variety along the way as well for yourself and for the reader. So, that was another reason, which is also why I mixed up the religious ceremonies attached to each funeral, because you don't want to repeat the same, sermon every time or the same ritual. You want to make things interesting.
I'm going to move into the chat. So anyone listening in who wants to ask questions, please type them in the chat. There's one, and Damon, you may feel you have largely answered this, so I will leave it up to you to decide. But Shanze Asif says, how does one navigate the intersection between identity politics and literature when it concerns communities that do not have a conduit to represent their own narratives? First of all, do you feel Black Africans don't have a conduit to represent their own narratives?
Well, you see, that's a very complicated question. Not in the sense that they didn't under apartheid. That a big project post-apartheid has been a sort of surge of memoir writing in this country, and a lot of those memoirs have come from Black writers who are actually for the first time telling the story of their lives and the sufferings that they went through. Those voices had been actively suppressed. But we're no longer living in a time where those voices are buried. So, anybody here now can write and publish a novel. So I don't think there's that sense that voices are being, silenced. On the other hand, somebody like Shalome in the book, how does she have access to telling her story? She's probably illiterate. Many people are illiterate in this country. They have no means of reaching a platform where they can speak for themselves, and no real idea of what's involved in such a platform. And you could say that the system, history, has placed them in that position. So, in that larger sense, there is no conduit for a lot of people to speak for themselves. But, that's probably true of almost every society. So, we could bat this debate back and forth and back and forth. But again, I would like to make the point that I really would defend the right of everybody, every writer, to indulge in the act of fiction and imagine whatever it is they want to imagine. Don't judge them for that choice. Judge them on how persuasively they carry it out. That would be what I believe.
I have to ask you about something you said early on, Damon, which startled me, which was that you've written some novels that your agent hasn't sent out. And has this been sort of, once in the course of your life right at the beginning? Because I can't imagine it happening to you in the last, 20 years or so.
No, it's been a while since that happened. It wasn't, my writing career began unnaturally early. I was sort of obsessed with writing from a very young age. And my first published novel I wrote when I was still in my last year at school, which caused a minor excitement locally, not because of the standard of the book, which is actually pretty horrible, but because of my age. So for lots of people, that's probably quite an exciting, departure or entrance rather into a literary life. But for me, I don't think it did me any favors, because as my age increased, it became evident that my literary skills were not up to par. So I, being a somewhat sensitive individual, was quite thrown, and it took me a very long time to find my feet after that first novel. So yeah, it was back in my 20s when I was still fumbling happily. But failed novels are like wounds. They stay with you forever, and the fear of writing another failed novel doesn't ever leave, which is maybe not that unhealthy, because it does keep me on my toes and keep me keenly focused on making things work.
Well, I think we can say quite confidently that if you have to deal with anything, it's that no one, Damon, ever again is going to say to you, this novel isn't good enough to send out.
I wouldn't be so sure. You see, the fear is very strong. Right. No, I'm as capable as anyone else of writing badly. I mean, Kamila, it's about real writing happens in the rewriting. It's about how you find solutions to the problems. And a time may come when I fail to find the solutions. Anyway, that's not the case right now, and I'm enjoying my brief moment in the sun.
Well, thank you very much, Damon, for giving us your time while you're in the sun. I'm afraid we're all out of time now. We will hope to see Damon in Lahore one day. But until then, thank you very much.
Really hope to get there. Thanks so much, Kamila, for the thoughtful questions and the lovely conversation. And if I don't see you in Lahore, I hope I see you somewhere else.
Somewhere else. All right. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Lahore Literature Festival for hosting this conversation.